Hello, welcome to Interabang's Chats. Today we have Debra Jo Immergut with us, and she's going to talk about her fabulous new novel, You Again, which is released today, July 7th. Welcome, Debra Jo. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Lori. Very happy to be here.
So you were actually one of our favorites at Interabang. You did a live event with us for your first novel, The Captives, and that was 3 years ago? About
2 years ago,
Okay.
2018.
And that was an Edgar nominated novel for a debut novel. And You Again has just it's been blowing up all over the place. It was a New York Times editor's choice. I think some of the wonderful adjectives that were used to describe it were immersive and stunning and eerily relevant. And that must be a really good feeling coming into that kind of press as you're ready to release your book today.
It's not too shabby.
And a Kirkus starred review months ago too. So we were all kind of waiting in anticipation. And I'm really lucky that I got an early read of the book. And tell us a little bit about the book and help us set it up in terms of what's going on with the character in the book.
The book centers on a woman named Abigail Willard. She is 46 years old. She is coming home from her job at a pharmaceutical firm where she's a designer to heading for her home in Brooklyn, where she has her 2 teenage sons and her husband. And she's in the cab, it's dark and rainy. She looks out the window and she sees a girl who she knows instantly is her younger self coming out of the door of a nightclub that she used to go to when she was in her early 20s. And she looks at this girl and she thinks, what could this be? How is this possible? She jumps out of the cab to get a closer look, becomes convinced that it is in fact her younger self. And that's the first scene of the book. And it sort of goes on from there. So it is about a kind of haunting, a kind of impossible visitation, and that leads her to really question and examine everything about her life. And I really wanted to explore one of those vantage points you reach in life where you look back and you consider all the choices you've made and you weigh them and you think about what you did right, what you did wrong, and really dive deeply into that, but through the sort of uncanny friendship that rises up between these two women.
And the Abby at age 46 is quite a bit different than the Abby at age 22.
Yes. At 22, Abby was aspiring to be a painter. She was what I describe in the novel as an experience junkie. Well, Abby really describes herself that way because she is writing all about this in her journal as she cites and sort of is haunted by this younger self. So she's scribbling it all down and she's recalling this experience junkie, this aspiring artist. And she's obviously disturbed and in some ways quite fearful about what this young woman might think of her now, that she has taken a job that is not, particularly being a star in the art world. She works in the corporate world. She's a mom, a married mom. And that was not exactly where her mind was at age 22.
Well, I thought one of the really neat things about the book is we think right away that it's a little bit more than just a visitation or like a ghost that Abby's seeing, because you're really great about giving some details about like what it was like 22, 24 years ago. I think the first scene there's a phone booth in the scene, and current day Abby even thinks like, my God, a phone booth. And there's a lot of detail about the fashion that the younger Abby is wearing too. That's quite a bit different.
Well, actually, should I read that first couple of lines and I will go right to that spot. So this is the opening of the book. And yeah, I really dove deep into memory of what it was like to be in your early 20s at that time. Abby, January 7th, 2015. I saw myself last night. I drove right by myself in a taxi through a winter rain, coming home very late from work on a shadowed block southwest of the Holland Tunnel. I gazed out the cab window, worn down from my day, and then suddenly she appeared, emerging from a dark doorway in silver platform sandals and a pink velvet coat. Me, the way I used to be. I yelped at the cab driver, "Stop, please stop." He stopped and I scrambled to pay him, snagged my tote loaded with unfinished paperwork from the office that I'd packed to not finish at home, and my purse holding cell phone and tampons and hair product, and in its deepest corners, a putty of crushed energy bar and compromised ibuprofen gel caps. I gathered up my bags and I leaped. It was raining. A very suspect sea stretched out between the cab and the curb, so I leaped. The girl, this glimpse of myself, stood back there at the corner, slipping a coin into a payphone. The mere fact of that payphone, extraordinary.
And so I think, if I'm remembering right, that that scene with the payphone, or the Abby that she's seeing then, is 22, and it's around 1990, 1991. Is that right?
That's right, 91.
And the current day Abby, the 46-year-old Abby who's writing in her journal, she doesn't have, I guess some of her memories are a little bit faded or a little bit foggy back at that time. She remembers a boyfriend, Eli, and she remembers that Abby was working for a guy that was kind of a creep. And there are things, though, that happen, and future encounters between the two Abbys that kind of help jog Abby's memory. And I wondered, just in terms of writing that, was that kind of was that difficult to kind of keep track, like what has the 46-year-old Abigail remembered up till now, and what she hasn't? And that seemed to me to be such a great element of the pacing of the book, that that there's some things that the 46-year-old Abby hasn't quite remembered or recovered from her memory, but it kind of leaves you hanging out there.
Yes. So one of the first things that present day Abby starts to realize is that her memories are strangely foggy of this specific year in her life. The year that, when this young woman who she's cited lived. And she just, she's moved on, so she hasn't thought about it that much. But as she tries to, recall, she realizes that there are some missing pieces in her memory, and she doesn't know why. And that's set up as a mystery. And, alongside Abby, it starts to come together. We start to piece it together from bits and pieces, and from these encounters with the younger woman who we call A. So it was tricky. It was a real brain teaser for me as a writer to deal with this sort of time-space continuum, and to figure out how these encounters would work, how to explore this mystery, how this sort of impossible happening that you're meeting your younger self in all its dimensions. So one of the things that I try to do, and I really challenged myself when I came up with the idea for this book, was to provide the reader with different possible explanations for what's going on with Abby and how she could possibly be meeting and talking to her younger self. And so, I'm juggling throughout the book, and the reader is too, a few different scenarios, that it might be some kind of physics wrinkle in time, quantum physics time travel. And I delve into that in a slight bit, like not too much to overwhelm us with the nitty gritty of quantum physics, but we've heard that wrinkles in time might be possible, that there's a lot more about the movement of time and space than we really understand. So we explore that just a little bit and touch on it. It might be a psychological issue. I mean, does this young woman actually exist, or is she a figment of present day Abby's imagination? That's also a possibility that Abby really seriously considers. She thinks she might be losing her mind. I mean, wouldn't you? If you were seeing your younger self, I think you'd go instantly to that. I'm losing my mind. And she is under a lot of stress. She's a working mom, and, got a full-time job, husband with a full-time job, financial stresses, teenage sons, getting into mischief. So she thinks she might be just going over the edge. And then there's also a possibility that it's a medical issue, that perhaps she's got an issue with her brain. And so we have some investigation into that possibility as well. And there are certain medical conditions that cause hallucination. So we explore that, and along with Abigail. And then I hope by the end, the reader comes to their own conclusion and also accepts that maybe there's some mystery to it too. And because life is mysterious, and that's what makes it really fun to write about.
Well, you talked about how Abigail, when she first starts encountering she and her memories start coming back. She refers to herself back then as an experienced junkie, and kind of a freewheeling, partying kind of gal that was very committed and passionate about painting, about her art, and wasn't at all interested in kind of like the typical, house and dog and husband and 2 kids kind of scenario that Abigail was kind of fallen into a bit. But when we start seeing what happens to Abigail, she kind of, in some ways, starts almost becoming, or maybe reverting to, an experienced junkie herself. We see her going back to art class. We see her becoming romantically involved with a detective that is helping her kind of figure out what's going on with her son, who started participating in political demonstrations. And so there is this a little bit of, I think, I don't know whether you would say regression, but she kind of, in a way, she's quite envious of the Abby that was the 22-year-old, not just because she's young, but because she seemed a little, I guess, would you say, more fearless?
Yes. Well, I think as we age, we get, and we settle into our lives, we have a lot more to lose than when we're young, unattached. And what I would say about Abigail is that she loves her life. I mean, she is very passionately committed to her family. She is a loving mother of these 2 boys. She has a long and loving, but sometimes difficult marriage with her husband, Dennis, who was also an aspiring artist once upon a time. And they actually met in art school as, young hopefuls. And they've both, because of the realities of adult life and perhaps, issues of inside themselves, they've sort of strayed from their art, and they've gone on that journey together. So that's been at once sort of helpful maybe for their marriage, but also difficult for their marriage. So she's in her life, she loves her life, and yet she's suddenly confronted with this young woman who starts reminding her of what her aspirations once were, and it starts to shake the foundations in a way that she didn't expect. Um, so yeah, she she gets she starts to dabble in a little bit of her, her old passions, and first, the art, which she has always really regretted straying from. And then, she's as she starts to kind of witness again this very passionate early relationship with Eli, who you mentioned before, that might stir up something in present day Abigail, and she starts to think about infidelities that she might never have thought about before. So this young woman comes into her life and really shakes it up hard.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Art is such a big part of the story. And there's a lot of great detail about painting. And I wondered, is this something that you've always kind of thought that this character, when you were kind of plotting out this kind of seeing yourself, this doppelganger type of novel, did you always know that the protagonist would be an artist, or was that something that came after?
Well, I would say that, that really goes to the part of this novel that is a really seriously personal exploration for me and kind of parallels my journey. So while I have never been able to meet my younger self and the foundations of my life have not been shaken like Abigail's are in the novel, I certainly struggled with straying from my creative dreams, and really being, or maybe I would say, shelving them. And part of that, I've been thinking about this because I've been getting asked about it. Whether I thought motherhood and marriage, both of which I've experienced and still am, get in the way of creative work. And I would say that's not always the case by any means. But I am a lousy juggler, and it really was difficult for me to do it all. So I did shelve my my writing aspirations for quite a while, but I never forgot about them, and I felt the pain of that for years. So it was part of what I really wanted to explore in this story, was what that means for someone who has a strong creative drive but is somewhat thwarted, or isn't really true to it. And I just needed to really dig into that, because that I felt very deeply, and I think that's, for me, the core of Abigail's character.
And the painting, I mean, have you painted? Have you done?
I really no. I mean, I enjoy it, and I do dabble in it. And I've always loved art, and was the girl in summer camp who wanted to hide in the arts and crafts cabin and not play softball and kickball. So it was a real pleasure for me to inhabit that, but that's not where my talent lies at all. Um, I do really gravitate toward visual artists and have lots of friends who are in that world, and so I was able to go into their studios, smell the paint, look at their beautiful messes that they made, and talk to them about their process. And all of that was the most fun part of the research that went into this book. And again, it's sort of like, that's one of the great things about fiction writing, is you get to play act and get into other people's shoes, and to wear the shoes of a painter was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, there's some really great detail about painting, and especially about color. I thought that was really wonderful. In terms of research, though, you talked about the kind of the three, and there might be more, but the most perhaps obvious explanations about what might be happening to Abigail, why she is encountering this person or believes she's encountering them. And I wondered, there is some good detail about different types of brain tumors and things like that, and then also the quantum physics part. So did you how do you kind of help yourself when you kind of go down those research bunny trails, and how do you know like when you shouldn't go down anymore, or whether you've had enough? I can imagine, I mean, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I could really get off course just kind of like going down one of those rabbit holes.
Yeah, well, I think you've probably heard a lot of writers say that it can be such a great procrastination tool because research and it is enjoyable to just delve into any area that you're curious about. So you can spend years really researching if you choose to. So yeah, it is a rabbit hole. You do have to be a little bit careful about going too deep in. And the other thing is, I wanted this to be, I really aim for a fast read, a streamlined read, but with a lot of I want it to have a lot of depth and a lot of meat to it. So that means like I cannot lard in paragraphs and paragraphs about quantum physics, even if I were able to write those, which I'm not sure I would. So that sort of puts some brakes on too. I knew I wanted to touch on it without overwhelming myself or the reader with too many details, but just sort of present some interesting theories that, for me as a total English major, non-math person, were so intriguing. Like the idea that every moment in time is actually happening all at once. That's a theory that Einstein's, I don't know if he stated it that way, but based on his calculations, like that's something that quantum physicists look at and have been able to prove is that all moments are happening at once. We just perceive them as happening in a certain order. Well, that's a really amazing thing to think about, and that sort of suggested to me. Actually, can you ask the question again, or just a brief?
No, absolutely. So there's a lot of information or detail in here about the medical or the I guess kind of the scientific reasons for why Abigail might be seeing herself. You get into a little bit of discussion about brain tumors and the symptoms of those, some of them, and the quantum physics issue. And I'm curious as to kind of how you discipline yourself or know when to stop when you start going down some of those avenues and researching.
I think both of those areas are actually so complex that I was pretty daunted by even daring to write about them. So I think while I found it interesting, I did reading, I did some talking to scientists that I know, but I recognized that just what I needed for purposes of Abigail's story. I didn't want to get too far down the rabbit hole for either as the writer or for my readers. So I try to touch lightly on them, but there's so much information, for example, on the medical side available on the internet, and I looked a lot at certain brain abnormalities and what was written about them, what the side effects were, what kinds of conditions might cause hallucinations, and explored that possibility, wrote about those. But yeah, I was somewhat intimidated by taking on both quantum physics and brain science, so there were some natural limits there in place for me.
One of the things that I think probably took a lot of work and time, but makes the book so alive and realistic, is the details about Manhattan in 1990, 91, which is where Abigail lives in Brooklyn, but comes into Manhattan for work. And you mentioned a lot of places. I'm wondering, are some of them still there? And did you just like walk around Manhattan like for a few weeks and take notes? How did you come about all that information in good detail?
Well, New York has changed so incredibly in those intervening years since the 90s, 30 something years. that it was tricky. And, so I lived in the same neighborhood, and really, let's just be honest, the same building that the young A lives in the book. That is the building I lived in. It was a 5-floor tenement house in the way west part of Greenwich Village, a cobblestone street. In the days when I was living there, it was still kind of it was very in demand, but it was still sort of an Italian neighborhood, working class. You would see grandmothers sweeping the sidewalks, and there were lots of little mom and pop grocery stores and shoe shine places. Now it's almost like a stage set. I mean, it's very, very different. However, there are a few holdovers. So yes, I've spent a ton of time in that area in the last few years, walking around. And so I know, for example, that the Corner Bistro, which is a place that I hung out at that age, was right around the corner from my apartment, is still there. It's still very much the same. It's still where the young 20-somethings go after work, and the hamburgers are still cheap and the beers are still cheap. So those places, there's a bar in the East Village that figures prominently in the story, and that figured prominently in my youth, that bar, and it's still there, cleaned up. And I talk about that in the book, about how it's been kind of cleaned up. And then I had some fun with the things that aren't there. So this boyfriend, Eli, had lived in a walk-up building in the East Village, and Abigail goes to try to find him or young A, and she's at that point in the story where she's chasing her a little bit. So she goes to where she remembers Eli lived, and there's just a giant glass condo building there, with all kinds of sort of modern young people talking on their cell phones and coming in and out. And she thinks, this is how, this is not happening. I'm not going to find them here. So so that was really interesting and fun, and also challenging. So I used the Brooklyn Bridge, I used Rockefeller Center, and other places that are sort of eternal in New York for some of their encounters and meetings.
Well, one of the things I read the book last year, actually, I think, when I first was able to get my hands on an advanced copy. And then in preparation for our talk, I read it again. And one of the things that I didn't recall was when we talk about Abby's older son, Pete, and some of the political demonstrations that he's engaged in, Antifa comes into play. And that seems very newly relevant, and I probably didn't hit me so much last year because that organization wasn't so much on my mind. But what made you kind of decide that that's where you wanted him to be kind of focus his agitation and his young friends who are trying to kind of shake up the system?
I think one of the things I love about being a writer, and I happen to be one who's really focused on memory, is that we have these old files that we've sort of stored away in our head that we get to rummage through and pick out interesting little bits and pieces. So Antifa is a very old file in my head from the 90s, from when I lived in Berlin, and that was the first time I'd ever heard of them or saw them. They were very active, and I think they still are pretty, they're around in Berlin these days. Antifa is a movement that has its roots in Europe in the years before, during, and after World War II, the anti-fascists. That's what it stands for, Antifa. And so I saw them, these kids who were basically my peers when I was in my 20s, when I lived in Berlin for 5 years with my then boyfriend, now husband, and we were working, we went right after the wall fell, working as journalists, and I was teaching there a bit. So, I got to know the city, and I always noticed these interesting young people in black who looked rowdy, who were living in squats, who fought with the police every year on May Day, which was like the International Workers' Day, still is. And they caught my eye and my imagination. And, I didn't really think about them much in the intervening years, but when they popped up again was around Trump's inauguration on that day, some Antifa came to DC on Inauguration Day, and they broke the window of a Starbucks and kind of got on the news. And I thought, oh, there they are. And I wonder, are they coming? Is this going to happen? Because, you know, one could sense that extremes of all kinds were bubbling up in this country, and there was a lot of passions on both sides. And so when I was writing this book and thinking about what my teenage character Pete might get into, I knew he was exploring and pushing the envelope, maybe in a little bit of the way that his mom did when she was young. I thought maybe he would come across a bunch of Antifa in a grimy basement in Brooklyn, way out in Brooklyn somewhere. And he does, and he begins to flirt with them. And then Abigail is as a mom, has to deal with this, and kind of develops her own feelings about it. And they get into all kinds of trouble because of it. But yeah, so it's in there. I had a sense that, I mean, I never thought that Antifa was going to be as much in the news as they have been this summer.
Right.
But I did have a sense that it could happen based on what's been going on in this country, and how the fringes are making noise right now.
And are they still extremely active in Berlin? I mean,
Well, I have actually been going back to Berlin every year the last few years, and because I was working on this book, I saw in the neighborhood where I was staying a flyer for a demo. That's what they call the demonstrations, and so I went, and it was an Antifa demonstration, and they come out against rent hikes and squatter evictions and police brutality, and they're sort of an all-purpose far left group. Right. And it was really fantastic for the book, for the research. It was not to say like I was sad, it was a non-violent demonstration. Nothing was broken. There were scads of police, but it was exciting for me as a writer to be there, knowing that it was almost like seeing my book come to life. And at that point I was revising, so I gleaned details and put them in about what it just felt like. And Abigail sees it in this early on in the second chapter. Abigail sees an Antifa demo happening near her office in Midtown Manhattan, and she feels this sort of passion and excitement of people just out there raising a bit of hell. I mean, I think there's a little piece of her that responds to that as a very responsible citizen. And I have to say, I felt a little bit of it too. Now, that's not to say I endorse, what they're doing, but I guess, a novelist is drawn to people with powerful passions.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mentioned at the beginning that today, actually, July 7th, is your release day. Congratulations on that. And I wanted to ask you, because books are probably more important to all of us than ever right now, but the way that books are published and the way that they're promoted and marketed has changed drastically over the last 5 months, just because of COVID and isolation and no book tours. And you did come to our store for your first novel, The Captives, and I think that you probably went to quite a few bookstores for author events. And I kind of wanted to get your experience on how it is this time around, and and some of the challenges, and I don't know, maybe there are a few silver linings as well.
Yeah, I think there are definitely silver linings. The first one that comes to mind, I mean, apart from the fact that I've been able to see more of my family than I have in a long time, because my son is home from college, and for a really hard and harsh reason, but for his mom, it's pretty nice to have him around for an unexpected stretch. you know, so my husband John and I have been enjoying that piece of this. But as a writer, I would love to see the solidarity. I'm in a group of authors called Lockdown Lit, and it's about 80 authors who are supporting each other because we're all coming out during this pandemic season, and that's been so rewarding, and that never would have happened if not for this. So there's a silver lining. You know, on the flip side, I would say it's really hard to feel that celebratory when our country's going through such a difficult time, a time of really, you know, social transformation, upheaval, loss, and you know, and just swirling news cycles. So you know, you feel a little bit as an author with your little novel, like, well, here it is, and you've just put it out there and hope for the best. As far as the virtual events go, I've just done a couple so far. I think in some ways they're great because people from all over can attend. So there's that upside. Certainly the personal contact is lost, and I think we're all missing that in various ways. It's a little sad not to be able to see my book on the shelves in stores. Right now, our bookstores are really barely open.
I'll take some pictures for
Here,
you. I'll take some pictures for you and send them.
yes, like I would. Yes, I mean, I will probably not likely see that many times. You know, the Captives, for example, was in airport bookstores. I don't know, are airport bookstores even happening now? It's a little, you know, so all of that is a little bit odd. But books are still got to be born, and people are reading. There's no doubt that people are reading and need stories and need solace. And so, you know, I'm hoping that I can bring that to some readers.
Well, I know a silver lining for us is that you are going to join us at the Interabang Book Club in September to talk about You Again, and I think that's a probably a benefit. You probably would have been traveling all over the place if not for this. So I guess, you know, we take our lemons and we make some lemonade, right?
Absolutely.
Well, it's so nice speaking with you today, Deborah. Good luck with the book. Happy release day, and all the best. And we'll talk to you in September.
Okay, thanks, Lori. And it's so nice to talk to you. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.